We have Professor Natalie Zemon Davis from the University of Toronto, Professor Elizabeth Elbourne from the Department of History and Classical Studies, Professor Annmarie Adams, who is a professor of architecture, and our moderator for today is Brian Lewis, a professor of history and classical studies. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brian so we can get the conversation started. Thank you, Brian.
Natalie, you talked about offering the first course on teaching women in the U of T in 1971, and you called it Society and the Sexes. Elizabeth talked about the missing women when she was an undergraduate in the 1980s. Could you both, or all three of you, explain what you see as the main differences in teaching women's history from the 70s onwards?
We called our course Society and the Sexes specifically because we tried to talk about men throughout. We didn't do it with the elegance and the subtlety of masculinity studies, but we really did. We did try to talk about the construction of masculinity. I think that the work on sexuality, the addition of queer studies, the deepened work on masculinity has, over the decades, from what I could see in my own time and everything that I've heard, I think this has enriched the program. The work that has been done in global history, global feminisms, the critiques that have come from different parts of the world, if I were to construct a course now, it would be very, very attentive to this new work.
I think that what's changed for me is the experience of the students. That it's a different environment and that students come with very different concerns, which I wouldn't want to enumerate because I don't particularly want to speak for my students, but I've still been struck by, for example, interest in gender fluidity and breaking down categories of gender, of finding things that were absolutely central for women in the 80s as of less concern and other issues of more concern. The huge shift that I found in teaching is shifting towards thinking about gender systems and as I said, masculinity, away from an initial focus on women, women as the missing actors, towards gender as a system of power.
Great question, and I might compare the course I teach now once in a while, which is called Sex in the Single Building, to the kind of courses I took as a student at Berkeley in the 1980s. I was lucky enough at Berkeley to have a pioneering women's historian, Mary Ryan, on my dissertation committee, and she, in her History of American Women course, referred to it as an add women and stir approach to history, and I think that's just so different than what we do now, which is to push Mary's cooking analogy. We might have it as a more blended history or a completely pureed kind of approach to the field.
You talked about blending. Elizabeth talked about the possible problems of the focus on masculinity as potentially bringing back a renewed focus on men. What are the costs and benefits of this shift away from add women and stuff?
Going back to the 70s when we were trying to defend these courses, which we had to do, in those years, the argument we really made, and we meant it, that it wasn't just an add-on. We claimed, and I think we were right, that the addition of women and gender courses, and we began to use the term fairly soon, would make a difference in the way you thought about history. In our field to begin with, we were, in my generation, we were having this kind of argument about those of us who wanted to be doing family and do class as much as gender, with those who were more committed to looking at the history of women, female solidarity, and I still think, just as I think that the debate about what the variables are that define gender, I think that this can be a creative debate. In a way, what we are talking about now, that tension, I think, should persist in the field, should maybe be central in courses, and let it keep going. There's no simple resolution here.
I feel like I absolutely am using the methods I developed in my work on women in space to study men in space. So for example, I have a new paper on men's clubs in Montreal. I've always had this theory, I call it big house theory, that any building designed for women or girls looks like an overblown house. Daycares, schools, anything, parts of hospitals. And so I'm trying to test that big house theory by looking at 3 men's clubs in Montreal. They definitely are big house. They are big blown up houses, but the power relations within the floor plan actually work in the opposite way. So I don't see them as one way or another. Studying masculinity in space is helping me to understand women in space.
I think that what we're trying to do in gender studies is get to a realistic understanding of the world in some ways, and that is not possible without encompassing a wide range of things, including masculinity. I think that is absolutely central to the field. It's transformed the way that I think and do my own work. I have observed in practical university politics that there are a couple of pieces of roadkill when you make that shift, and that might include community alliances in some respects. It might include some generational tensions. But I actually don't think for a minute that that has anything to do with the intellectual argument for I think the value of transforming the field.
I'd just like to thank our 3 panelists for tremendously inspiring reflections and words over the last couple of hours. Thank you very much.